On behalf of the Eastern Transportation Coalition, we welcome you today to this webinar they are hosting on advanced driver assist systems. We're going to just go through a few housekeeping items and then get right to the webinar. First, we are in Zoom webinar. You can have your audio, use your audio either through your computer or through your phone. Please note that this web meeting is being recorded. Should you have any questions, please reach out to Esther via email. And the chat box today is not available to participants. However, the way you can ask your questions is in the Q&A box, and we have two different ways to do that. There is a Q&A icon you're going to click on. You just type your questions in, and Lisa Miller from the coalition will monitor those, and we have a Q&A session set up at the end. If you'd like to ask a question verbally and we have some time, you can raise your hand. When you raise your hand, that puts you at the top of the list and we know that you have a question, and then Lisa can call on you and we can unmute your line. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Lisa Miller. She's the Innovation Program Associate with the Eastern Transportation Coalition. Lisa?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Joanna. And good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please, Joanna. We have an amazing webinar for you today. We're going to be talking about all things ADAS, Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers for you today. They're industry experts, but of course, first, a little bit about our coalition. We are a coalition of 17 member states, plus the DC Department of Transportation. And our newest member state, Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, who joined in March of this year. And essentially, we connect our members together for cross-border solutions. And you may know our former name, the I-95 Corridor Coalition. Next slide, please. Essentially, what we do is we bring people together. We also provide data and tools for our members, like our Transportation Data Marketplace. And we're a relatively small organization, which means we can be very nimble and tackle projects and topics that really improve traffic flow technology adoption. Next slide, please. We are a member-driven organization of transportation agencies all up and down the East Coast. And we're working with our member states to determine how to best prepare for this inevitable shift on their roadways, both as individual states and as we function as a region. You'll notice that we have a new group under our innovation group, the electric vehicles group, which of course is very front of mind right now in our industry. Next slide, please. So as we move forward, there are several coalition events that are not necessarily CAV focused, but the Transportation Data Marketplace, we have some validation tech advisory committees, and a lot of these events are open to our members only. So if you're not a member and you're on the East Coast, please let me know if you'd like to join. We also have a significant amount of previous events that are available on our website or on our YouTube channel. And if you're watching this webinar now, we do have our CAB webinars from the spring and from previous years on our YouTube website as well. Next slide, please. Our agenda for today, we have an action-packed full agenda for you. We have several speakers who are going to be talking about different components of ADAS in their state and across the industry. And as Joanna mentioned, we will have some time at the end for Q&A and discussion. So please put all of your information and your questions and your comments in that Q&A box, or raise your hand, and we'll certainly have a lively discussion at the end. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay, I would love to introduce our speakers now and read some bios. We are very fortunate to have Ms. Christine Nizer, and Chrissy was appointed the administrator of the Maryland Department of Transportation Motor Vehicle Administration, the MDOT-MVA, and the governor's highway safety representative in August of 2015. Prior to that appointment, Ms. Nizer served as the MDOT-MVA's chief deputy administrator and deputy administrator for central operations and safety programs for over 8 years. She also held management positions at the Maryland Public Safety Service Commission, the Maryland General Assembly, and the Office of Homeland Security. Ms. Nizer is the immediate past chair of the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. I hear you had an amazing conference last week, so kudos to you, Chrissy, and your team on that. And Ms. Nizer was also the AMVA Region 1 past president, a member of the International Registration Plan, Inc. Board of Directors, and a member of the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials Standing Committee on Highway Traffic Safety. Ms. Nizer is a graduate of the Leadership Maryland program in 2011 and was named Woman of the Year in 2014 by the Women in Transportation Seminar Baltimore chapter. Congratulations, Chrissy. Ms. Nizer earned a Master's of Science degree in Public Policy from the Eagleton Institute of Rutgers University and a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science from Goucher College. We're also very fortunate to have Ms. Kathleen Rizk today with us. Kathy is a Senior Director and User Experience Benchmarking Technology Manager with J.D. Power. Kathy is responsible for the Tech Experience Index, the TXI study, Mobility Confidence Index study, and leading the future of mobility work, including J.D. Power's consortium involvement with MIT and MCity. Previously, she managed J.D. Power's automotive technology engagements with vehicle manufacturers and suppliers. Welcome, Kathy. Thank you for being here. We have Shane McKenzie. Shane is the Connected and Automated Vehicle Technology Lead for the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Shane joined the Transportation Cabinet in 2013, serving in the Division of Planning, and Shane currently serves as the CAV Technology Subject Matter Expert in the State Highway Engineer's Office. Prior to KYTC, Shane interned for the Port of Portland, working on the Portland International Airport expansion, and Shane was also an assistant city engineer for the city of Battleground, Washington, and worked for CH2M Hill, now Jacobs, as a project engineer in Chicago. Thanks so much for being here, Shane. We also have Steve Kuciemba, and Steve is with WSP, and he's the National ITS and CAV Practice Lead. Steve works with clients nationally and internationally with more than 35 years of experience in the transportation technology sector. Steve brings a broad set of experiences in planning, engineering, and policy. During his tenure at the Maryland State Highway Administration in the early 90s, Steve worked closely with counterparts in other states and the Northeast, helping to launch the Eastern Transportation Coalition, and Steve also served as a vice chair of the first ever steering committee. So thank you all so much for being here. We have a great lineup for you today. Next slide, please. Now, our Eastern Transportation Coalition sponsored events, this webinar here. We have 184 people registered from 30 different states all across the country, which is amazing. MPOs, consultants, public sector, private sector research. So you're among a group of folks that are definitely interested in learning about this space and this work, and we hope to have a good discussion today. Next slide, please. All right, framing the discussion. Here we go. Next slide, please. Now, what is ADAS? What is ADS? Start at the very basic level here. Now, almost all vehicle crashes, accidents are caused by human error, which can be avoided somewhat with ADAS technologies. And the role of ADAS is to prevent deaths and injuries by reducing the number of accidents and crashes and the serious impact of those that cannot be avoided. ADS, of course, automated driving systems, is a little bit different and incorporates a lot of those ADAS features by allowing the vehicle to operate without a human driver. Now, at the end of 2020, only approximately 10% of the cars on the road had some sort of ADAS features. However, nearly 96% of the 2020 vehicle models came equipped with at least one driver assistance system, such as an automated emergency braking, blind spot warning, or lane keeping assist. So this is certainly something that's very much taking off. Now, I believe Chrissy will talk a little bit more about the Clearing the Confusion document, but the reason why we're here today is certainly to talk about the technologies of ADAS and ADS and how we can represent those better to our driving public and help them to better understand what they're all about. Next slide, please. We publish our annual work plan every year, and the coalition's work plan this year, our membership and our executive board gave us some really excellent guidance on all things connected automated vehicles. Focus on incorporating CAV into our other projects. CAV is really important, but of course, we have only so much bandwidth at our departments of transportation. And things like planning for electric vehicles is also immensely important right now. And a lot of the work in the CAV space right now is moving towards testing, deployments of scale, and pilot projects. Now, the coalition has our eyes and ears out there for our members, and we're always learning new things. At events like ITS World Congress, at Arts 22, that was this summer out in California, there's so much synergy and energy towards this national strategy for CAV. Some of our members, of course, are very much front and center on this work, and the Maryland DOT, I believe, was the first in the nation to have a mention of ADAS in their driver's ed manual. Pennsylvania DOT just unveiled a new Penn Start testing track and some automated vehicle guidance documentation. And a number of our states, like North Carolina, have roadmaps where they're planning on actively integrating CAV into their framework. So CAV isn't a distant glimmer in our eyes. It's already here, and it's already saving lives, and it's already being implemented on our network and our roadways here. Next slide, please. So essentially, to help frame our discussion a bit further, this is why ADAS is important. This is a quote from Greg Brannon from AAA. And not only equipping vehicles with these ADAS technologies, but educating and informing the public about it is critically important. As agencies incorporate more CAV technologies into their long-range plans, the OEM use and deployment of ADAS technologies can certainly assist with crash reduction and better mobility. So it all goes very much hand in hand. Next slide, please. Okay, my nephew is 14 years old. And when I saw him last week, he said, "Hey, are you still working with driverless cars?" So lesson number one, kids, listen to everything you say, because I think the last time we talked about my job, he was probably 10. So he remembered that. Second lesson, he said to me, "My dad said that there are cars that drive themselves now. I want one because then I can play video games when I'm on the way to school." I'm sure many of you have had similar conversations like this, but that's why documents like the Clearing the Confusion document and collaborative work in this space is so important. But what you see on the screen here is essentially what the public sees. They see crashes that are in the news. The California DMV was just in the news for essentially calling Tesla out on some of their self-driving language that they're using. Just 22% of automakers, just 22% of the public believe that automakers should focus on self-driving vehicles, while 80% simply want their current ADAS technology to work better. So this is from a AAA survey that was at the beginning of last year. And you can see the sentiment there. People are really looking for these technologies to be on their vehicles. Next slide, please. I will end and turn it over to our subject matter experts. But before I do that, I definitely wanted to mention the first ever National CAV Day. It's coming up on October 8th. And kudos to Maryland DOT for spearheading this. It's going to be great. We're starting a little bit quieter this year with some social media posts, some press releases, but the idea here is to move forward with educating and informing the traveling public about all of these great technologies and how we as practitioners see the benefit of these technologies in making the roadways safer and more efficient. Next slide, please. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for being here. Chrissy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank the Eastern Transportation Coalition to inviting us here today to talk about CAV technology, as well as what we're doing in Maryland in the area of ADAS education. So if you please turn to the next slide. So there's a lot that's been going on in Maryland. About 6 years ago, we formed what we call our CAV working group, and that really is the center of all activity related to CAVs as well as ADAS technology in Maryland. We often joke that it started off with about 10 or 12 of us in a room. Most of us were Maryland Department of Transportation employees. That group has grown immensely, and we now have several hundred individuals on the distribution list and quite an active attendance. We've gone back to in-person meetings, and we've had a great attendance as we've gotten back together in person, but kept that connectivity even remotely during the COVID time period. And it really is about that diverse group of stakeholders. So we engage all levels of government, state and local. We've had our federal partners there. We look at the IT sector as well as public safety, elected officials from our state legislature in particular. We have subgroups for emergency responders, freight, policy, and technology, and they all feed up into the CAB working group and report back in terms of what's going on. We also have a CAB strategic framework, which we finished last year, that really outlines what our focus is in Maryland and helps frame where we're going. It also is really helpful, I think, for all of our stakeholders to understand what our priorities are and where we're going in this area. I think collaboration, as you can see from the heading of this slide, is really the key word that we've used from the beginning, recognizing that this area is evolving so quickly, and no one entity or group has all the answers. We really have embraced the idea that we want to bring as many people to the table. We want to hear great ideas, and we want to work together collaboratively. And really this process we put together in terms of the expression of interest, which allows entities who are interested in doing testing on our roadway to reach out to us, as well as our highly automated vehicle permit process do exactly that. We reached out to industry. We asked them to be a part of the process. We asked them to help develop what it looks like. It is unique for each different entity because we know that each research project is going to be different in its own right. And so we work with whatever entity reaches out to us and determine what is needed to have approval of that program. We also, with our legislature, worked on a personal delivery device approval program. They established a pilot program under state law. And we also allow for truck platooning. That's something that was adopted a few years ago in terms of our legislature. In addition, we've got a site that allows folks to determine where they can do testing in Maryland. This is, again, something we heard from individuals that were interested in testing. They really wanted to know where they could go and what they could do. So again, over 550 stakeholders, just really great participation. We're also participating in many of the national activities, again, to stay connected, to hear what's going on, and to contribute to the conversation. Although we're engaged in testing level 4 vehicles and certainly embracing the mobility opportunities of CAB, today, obviously, we're talking about levels 1 and 2, otherwise known as ADAS. With that, let's turn to the second slide. So Lisa mentioned that I am also Governor Hogan's highway safety rep. It's really a role that I cherish, and I think we're all in the transportation field committed to bringing our fatalities down and trying to figure out how we can come together and do that. And so when we look at the numbers, the potential to prevent roughly 40% all crashes involving pedestrian vehicles. In Maryland, we had 563 fatalities last year. Obviously, 563 too many, but the idea of potentially reducing that percentage. And then even if you look at the next bullet, the percentage of injuries as well. And so it's really an exciting area to be able to think that we can bring down those numbers. In fact, as every state has your statewide strategic highway safety plan, we in Maryland have intentionally integrated CAV and ADAS conversations into that document so that we know as we're moving forward, it's an important safety and planning document that we've incorporated that into our approach. So we want to make sure that we're looking at that in terms of vehicle technology on the roadways and how we move forward together. We want to make sure that it is part of all of our plans moving forward, both at the state as well as the local levels. So as we look at use cases as well as future funding, it's really important that we include that. So things like the freight plan, the state agency report, the consolidated transportation plan, statewide transit plan, greenhouse gas emissions action plan, just a few of the examples of how we try to integrate it into everything we do. And so we really think it's important to make sure that it is part of those documents and part of our efforts as we move forward. Next slide. And so I love this graphic because it really tells the tale as we think about ADAS and how technology can help us when it comes to highway safety. This just has a few of the technology developments as well as outside impact. We know those things tend to impact what happens in terms of roadway fatalities. But, you think of things that we now take for granted in terms of the seatbelt and automatic braking, electronic stability control. These have all been huge game changers in terms of our ability to bring down fatalities. Right there around the middle, you can see our primary belt laws. And, we just had several weeks ago a crash demonstration. We actually crashed 2 vehicles with dummies inside to show the difference when somebody's properly belted versus not being properly belted. And it was really remarkable. Dr. Thomas Scalia from Shock Trauma was there with us and talked about crashes that he sees, unfortunately, way too often, which show the same impact. And in the demonstration that we did, the individual who's a passenger in the back seat actually was flung forward and wound up injuring the what would have been the driver in the front seat. And so when you think about that being real people, and unfortunately what our hospitals and trauma centers see all the time, it just tells why it's so important for us to focus in these areas and help to educate people about why it's important to use them and not turn them off or not ignore them. So next slide. So we know that, as Lisa mentioned, that the technology on the roadways is really increasing. You can see the AAA estimate in terms of 93% of new vehicles in the U.S. Having ADAS, and certainly new model year 2023 will come with some of that emergency braking technology. Meanwhile, the challenges, I think, and some of us hear this, there's different name brands, right? Different manufacturers call things differently. There's also a desire to call things that sounds really on the cutting edge of technology. We understand that certainly from a sales perspective, but we don't want to give customers misimpression about over relying on them and not the importance of staying engaged in the vehicle. And that's really clear in terms of the driver having the knowledge of when features are engaged, when they're not engaged, and how to interact with them. I also think it's important as we look at, our state departments of transportation, as well as our driver license agencies. We're interacting with customers throughout our states all the time. And what role can we play in messaging? Also, how do we bring in our manufacturers and dealerships, our driving schools, insurance companies, repair shop, and other agencies really that are focused in highway safety? The bottom line is we know that ultimately self-driving technology is what we're striving for, but really communicating that message that you as a driver are still responsible for operating your vehicle at all times. That's really the key. And that's really the message that we try to always communicate, whether it's in our driving manual or other education that we might do. Next slide. Speaking of the driver's manual, and it was mentioned, we just updated that manual with some ADAS information. We think we're the first state to do that based on the survey of some other jurisdictions. It is something we're really proud of. Obviously, it's that manual that all of our novice drivers are using or picking up to figure out what they need to know about driving. And so, it is now time that we incorporate this kind of technology in from the beginning. As they learn about what's important in driving, this should be a part of that conversation. And so we're excited about that development. We're also excited about another project that we were invited to participate in with NHTSA. It was led by the American Driver and Traffic Safety Association to develop ADAS education for driver education instructors. Again, the idea that, we want to make sure that the folks that are teaching our new drivers understand how to engage with the technology and what the responsibility is for the driver. So we brought together representatives from AAA, NHTSA, AMBA, and others, and it really tried to tackle, how do we address this? How do we get the information out, and how do we make sure that folks truly understand? So we're excited that Maryland's been approved to provide a 3-part workshop to our driver ed instructors that actually is starting in October. And so we're encouraging participation in addition to the the participants were also going to be filming it, so there is the ability for others to be able to watch this instruction over time. NITS actually used these same materials to develop a two-part webinar series for law enforcement liaisons, obviously another really important component of how our law enforcement officials can inform and influence professionals as well as the communities in which they serve. Law enforcement liaisons from the Maryland State Highway Safety Office were also engaged, and I'll say that's a great resource for involving folks who are motivated in the same way. So M.MVA developed a one-page flyer to share the materials, and there is access to it when the slides are distributed. You'll have that as well. You heard a little bit about the first ever CAV day from Lisa. We're really excited about that. And the partnership there to focus awareness on CAVs in terms of education of the general public. This year, we're really going to focus on ADAS. So October 8th is that day to align with the DARPA Grand Challenge from 2005. A social media toolkit and graphics are provided, and again, available online for any organization who wants to join in. We really think it's a great opportunity for those transportation agencies and safety partners to really come together and align in a messaging that talks about the importance of the technology and also the importance of the driver still remaining in control of the vehicle. Next slide. So following the ADAS information being added to the Maryland Driver's Manual, questions are also being added to our online practice tests as well as our knowledge test that's required for all our new learner's permit applicants. We're also adding it to other documents such as our rookie driver handbook, where they'll be recording the practice test. And again, the driver education curriculum in Maryland driver education is required of all new drivers, regardless of age. That means we're going to be able to touch all of our new drivers and make sure this information is part of what they learn from the very beginning. We're also collaborating with other states to provide ADAS education materials as a member of the PAVE Public Sector Advisory Council and in partnership with TETC. A small team from our CAV team pulled together to submit a proposal for research to the Transportation Research Board and the Behavioral Traffic Safety Cooperative Research Program. It's an applied contract research program that provides practical and timely solutions to problems facing highway safety offices, DOTs, law enforcement agencies, and other stakeholders. Each year, GHSA refers a research program to TRB consisting of high priority problems for which solutions are required by the traffic safety community. So we're proud that our Maryland ADAS research submittal has been chosen as one of the 5 projects. Requests for proposal are expected to be advertised in October. And last but not least, we're planning a fall workshop to follow up on the ideas presented by the CAV working group members at our August 2022 meeting, which focused on that topic. Next slide. So what you see here is really a summary of the ideas posted by our CAV working group members at our August meeting that I just referenced, where we talked about ADAS technology. The intent really is to do a deeper dive in terms of the ideas that came up and to develop some potential opportunities that we can do collaboratively. Circling back to my mention of Maryland CAV working group, I always like to say that education starts at home, and that starts with our CAV working group. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we've been meeting for several years, and frankly, in the beginning, many of our members and our attendees didn't have that firsthand experience with the technology. So as we started, we really had a demonstration as part of each meeting, different technology types, but things that folks could interact with and learn firsthand. It's really important as we're making policies, as we're figuring out how we work with our partners in the private sector, that we have a firsthand understanding of what we need to do. And so the idea that we lead through example and we bring that technology in person is really important. So with the CAV working group as the core, education has spread to other subgroups within MDOT and the various business units. So we've got state agencies, our planning departments have been educating local governments, and now, we're working on our outreach to others as well. Lots of information to share and lots of good best practices. Next slide. So again, lots of great resources are out there. Most of you are probably aware of these, but thought it'd be a great reference. There's so much important work that's being done in this area in terms of how do we talk about things in a consistent way? How do we make sure that we're not confusing the driver further? It's already a lot of technology in the vehicle and we want to make it accessible. Thing that frustrates me more than anything is when I hear somebody say, well, I just turned it off because I didn't know how to interact with it. We want to make sure that we're communicating in a clear and consistent manner and that we're all working together for that same end goal. And so with that, show my contact information on the next slide, and we'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. And Roxanne, I see you have your hand up. Would you mind typing your question into the chat box? Or if it was an error, just wanted to make sure you knew that I saw you there. Chrissy, that was really great. Thank you so much. I think what I'm learning from your presentation is definitely your sampling of CAV projects shows the immense number of key audiences that we have here. Of course, we have the public, and I mentioned that in my intro slides, but our law enforcement partners, the internal audiences, the external audiences, you have a really good cross section. So kudos to you on that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, Kathy, feel free to take it away, but I'll encourage everyone again before Kathy starts her presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A box and please raise your hand at the end. We'll do some Q&A. Okay, Kathy, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you for inviting me in today to talk to you about why JD Power feels it's very important to explain ADAS technologies for both consumer awareness, as we find a lot of customers don't have any idea what technology is actually on the vehicle, as well as understanding that technology. So we know that customers are having a very difficult time in terms of what the capability is, how to operate that technology. So, again, JD Power from all of our data is just finding that customers are struggling with ADAS technologies. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to change the page on the next page. So just really quickly on JD Power, if you're not familiar with us, JD Power is the voice of the customer. So we do over 175 benchmarking studies in 20 countries, surveying over 5 million consumers a year. So we have a wealth of data on what customers expect in that user experience they have with whatever the product is. We do more than just the automotive industry. But in particular, in my area, we work with vehicle manufacturers and suppliers, and we try and take this data that consumers are telling us in terms of what's difficult for them to use, where are they running into problems, in particular with ADAS as well as the rest of the vehicle, but we try and work with them to make it a better user experience, and especially from a human machine interface perspective, or HMI, where we want them to understand what the warnings mean, what the icons mean, the colors mean, how to change the settings. We try and make that as simple of a process as possible. So moving over into the presentation. One of the first things that I wanted to point out is, why JD Power feels this is so important. And I started to allude to it on the cover page there, but there's really two reasons. And one is obviously for acceptance of higher levels of automation. We know that customers have to have a good experience at lower levels. If they don't trust this technology, they won't continue to want this as you move forward. So we do a lot of studies, and one of them is our Mobility Confidence Index study, where we're tracking consumer readiness for, AVs. And we find that a lot of them aren't ready for it, right? They think it's good for somebody who can't drive right now, or, for transporting goods, but not for themselves. And we find that when people are using ADAS technologies like active driving assistance, they have a higher propensity to be comfortable with higher levels of automation. The other reason ADAS is so important in terms of education is we find that it affects road safety. So when we look at what's happening in the data that we're getting, we find that customers are not using the ADAS features properly or consistently. And both of those are required in order to get the maximum benefit of this technology and not have something detrimental happen when we have unintended uses. So we found is that customers don't understand the capability. They don't know what the reaction of the vehicle is going to be for some of these technologies. They also don't understand a lot of the limitations. So they'll think something is not working when it actually is working, but they just don't truly understand what that capability is. And we also know that they don't know what the state the feature is in. So is it in a ready state? Is it in an active state? What do the colors mean? What do the icons mean? How do you change the settings? They struggle with all of this around these ADAS technologies. And they also don't know all the time what the driver's role is. I mean, Tesla is obviously one of the examples, but we still find with some of these other ADAS technologies, they don't understand it. For example, with lane keeping assistance, right? We find that a lot of people think that could actually navigate you around a pothole, So they don't understand the driver's role, that they have to maintain full control of the vehicle, and that this technology is just meant to assist them. On the next slide, I wanted to just show you a little bit around feature usage, because what we're finding is that customers are not using these features to the maximum benefit. So on the left part of this chart here, this is from our Mobility Confidence Index study that actually releases next week. We found that when we ask customers, how often are you using these ADAS technologies, you'll find that they're not using them every time they drive. Now, for some of them, like active driving assistance or adaptive cruise control, that's fine, right? That's the expectation. But for these safety features like blind spot warning or forward collision warning or automatic emergency braking, these are something that customers should use every single time they drive. And if you look at these scores, it's 52% or less. So there's a problem there. And if we go to the opposite side of the spectrum there, we have people who don't use the technology. So that could be they've never tried it, or they've used it and they stopped using it for whatever reason. They didn't trust it. They didn't think they needed it. But you can see here again that when we have technology that provides intervention or automation versus a warning, you have a higher percent of people not using that technology. We attribute part of this to a level of comfort, right? So again, to improve, that road safety, we really need customers to understand the importance of these technologies so that they're using them and they're using them frequently. They're using them properly and frequently. And we avoid some of these extremes where we don't have people having this technology like automatic emergency braking, forward collision set to on all of the time. On the next slide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It will be in the deck, but we find that trust is really one of the most critical factors in getting customers to accept AVs. And there's many things that feed into this, and especially their experience at lower levels of automation. So when we get complaints, because J.D. Power tracks quality, and so customers will tell us about their experience in the first 90 days of ownership of their vehicle. And we'll find that customers are complaining about ADAS technologies because they work inconsistently. Well, some of that feeds into the infrastructure, right? If the lane markings aren't visible, then the lane support technologies aren't going to work properly, right? And the naming conventions confuse them. They get false positives or false negatives. It doesn't work around a curve. And so all of these things impact, users' trust with these technologies. And it's really critical that we start to address some of this so that customers can have a stronger trust with ADAS technologies as we move up the levels of automation. On the next slide, J.D. Power tracks penetration of features. So we have a database called Helix, and in Helix, we track 80% of the vehicles on the road. On a VIN level, we know what technology, including ADAS, is on the vehicle. And so you can see here in the last 4 years, the increase in penetration of these level 1 features, and it's going up quite quickly. And coinciding with that is J.D. Power in the auto industry is known for what we call our initial quality study. And that's what I mentioned a few minutes ago, is that's where customers report problems they have with their vehicle after 90 days of ownership. And one of the areas we look at is ADAS technologies. So that's a category. And in terms of complaints, this has a high number of complaints in the study, and they're growing. So in 2022, we had 23.1 PP100, which is problems per 100 vehicles. That's a quality metric that the industry uses in terms of number of complaints that customers are reporting to us about their vehicle. And I've got the definition on the bottom of the slide for you if you want more information on it. But what it tells us is that as this penetration is growing and more customers are getting exposed to these ADAS technologies, they're reporting more problems, but not necessarily are truly problems, but some of it is lack of understanding of what the capability is, what the limitations are on these technologies. So they may report something working inconsistently or inaccurately when it's actually a limitation of the vehicle. They also are having a very hard time in terms of difficult to use. So, as I mentioned, they don't know the state the technology is in. They don't know what the settings mean. For a technology like automatic emergency braking, one OEM uses the terminology of a settings option to set it as fast, normal, or slow. Well, who's going to pick a setting of slow in terms of automatic emergency braking? And, it's confusing to customers. So again, these are warning bells to us that these problems are increasing as the penetration's increasing, and it's partially due to the fact that consumers don't understand these technologies. On the next slide, we mentioned, this was mentioned in the previous presentation as well, but there's this low comprehension of ADAS features. And, AAA put this study out in 2019, and they looked at the number of names that are used for each technology. And you can see for just automatic emergency braking, it was 40 different names. For adaptive cruise control, 20 different names. In fact, I was on a call with a journalist the other day, and he was driving a premium vehicle, and he looked at the name and thought it was adaptive cruise control and almost rear-ended somebody because he expected it on there, misunderstood the definition, and thought that it was going to slow automatically, and it didn't. This is what's happening is customers are confused because of the fact that we don't have any type of standards. So JD Power has been working with AAA and Consumer Reports, National Safety Council, PAVE, and SAE to try and standardize what the auto industry, and we hope what DOTs will be using in terms of naming conventions, so that everyone is using the same names consistently so consumers can understand what these technologies are and what they mean. And on the next page is our Clearing the Confusion document. So this is where we've put together a list of ADAS technologies and a description that we are pushing for the industry to start to adopt. And we're hoping that, as I mentioned, that the DOTs will start using this terminology wherever you're addressing ADAS as well. This was just released in July, so it's our latest version, but we continue to work together as an advocate for consumers to try and get some common naming conventions. On the next slide, this is going to become even more critical because, we're going to add more and more ADAS technologies, but we've also got, cellular vehicle to everything coming. And so, when you're working with a vehicle manufacturer on these technologies, as I mentioned, I work with them, when they're in development, and you'll see that the ADAS technologies are being developed by one group and the CV to X by another. So we might find a technology that's got a name very similar between these two categories, and yet they do completely different things. So you're going to have a customer who's very confused in terms of whether that technology with a similar name is going to provide intervention, whether it's a warning. I mean, this is just a recipe for disaster as we add more and more of this. So it's highlighting the need even more for driver education on these technologies, as well as common naming conventions. On the next slide, I just wanted to show you, I was talking early on about the fact that consumers don't understand the technologies, and there's multiple points of imprecision. So if we look at our lane support technologies, the lane departure warning, lane keeping assist is one example, and we take just the speed requirement. When we surveyed consumers, we found that over 70% inaccurately think these technologies work at all speeds. And they absolutely do not. They start somewhere between 30 and 45 miles per hour before they can activate. So you already have people on the road thinking a technology is actually activated when it's not. And then we have less than 30%. I find this one very shocking. Less than 30% of consumers understand the reaction of the vehicle if they go over the lane marking. So they didn't even expect that it would provide a warning in terms of that's what was going to happen when they went over the lane marking. So again, they don't understand what the reaction is going to be. And they don't understand the capability. If you look at the right of the chart, we had a whole battery of things like, will the vehicle do this or that? And, based on having this technology active. And, people there, almost 70 some, percent wrote that it would work in all weather conditions. So lane keeping assist, lane departure warning doesn't work in all weather conditions. It does not operate reliably on curves, but we had roughly, 60% of people thinking it would. And as I mentioned earlier, they thought it could drive around potholes. Almost 1/3 of people thought it could drive around a pothole. And the list went on. I don't have them all in here, but it just goes to show you that even with one level 1 technology, there are multiple points of misunderstanding in terms of how these technologies work. On the next slide, we found, as I was mentioning, our MCI study, our Mobility Confidence Index study, we asked them, is there a fully automated self-driving vehicle on the road today? And of course, you can see there from our Wordly that Tesla comes to mind, right? There's a high percent of people who think that. In fact, there's over 50% of the people in our survey thought that there was already a self-driving vehicle, a fully automated self-driving vehicle on the road. So we do have some test vehicles out there, right? But these are not fully automated self-driving vehicles. So we have this misunderstanding in terms of what the capabilities of these vehicles are. And that results in non-intended uses as well as too much reliance. The driver has to know how to stay, in touch with that vehicle, because these are just meant to be assist and not take over. On the next slide, one of the things that we know from the history of technology going into cars, especially over the last 10 years, that traditional methods of educating consumers on technology doesn't work. So as we found with infotainment over the last 10 years, as we've gone from a small little radio to a large screen, the more complex it's gotten, the more complaints we receive around that technology as customers find it difficult to use because they don't understand all that capability. It's too much for them to take in at delivery. And the owner's manual and learning it on your own doesn't work. And the dealer doesn't have time to teach that level of detail to consumers. And we know that, from these more basic levels. But as we continue on to adding all these ADAS technologies and CV2X technologies, this is going to get worse and worse. On the next slide, we know that the dealer plays a very important role. In fact, when the dealer is involved, we'll see frequently higher satisfaction, which you can see here with our AEB. Our AEB slide right here, where we have higher levels of satisfaction when people learn from the dealer. But you also find higher usage. Frequently they want this technology again. But the dealer can't teach everything. And in terms of some of these technologies like AEB, right, they can't demonstrate this technology, they can only explain it. But even having that explanation and preparing a customer that this is going to occur, and it might scare you, but it's really for a safety reason, and it's important that you keep this on, really drives the difference in our data in terms of that user experience. So we know it's effective. But on the next slide, we know the dealer can't be our only line of defense, right? It could be our first line of defense, but it can't be the only thing we count on for all of these technologies. The dealer has roughly a 40-minute sweet spot where consumers' retention and satisfaction with that delivery process starts to decline. And in that time, the dealer is trying to get the customers signed back up to come in for service because that's where they make money. They need to get the phone set up in the vehicle to help the customer, and they need to get the vehicle app up and running because that's where the vehicle manufacturer makes money on subscription services. And then beyond that, we have all these technologies and they can't cover them all. So we know we have to start looking at other methods to educating consumers on ADAS technologies. On the next slide, consumers from our data are seeking to find out more information, right? They want to know how to operate the feature, how to turn the feature on. It sounds very simple, but we have some very complex infotainment systems and cluster systems in the car where customers don't know how to actually even get into it, or the setting is so many layers down with complex names that they might not know where to go to even reach that technology. So we need to help them answer some of these questions, like how to turn it on, what the symbols mean, what the colors mean. Because otherwise, they're operating the system, but just, learning on as they go and not truly understanding that capability and what it means. On the next slide, we asked as part of our Mobility Confidence Index, how would you like to learn about lower levels of automation? And I think it's interesting to see that the consumer perspective, and we are seeing there on the previous slide that customers want more education, but now we're seeing a little bit wider bandwidth of where they want to be educated or how they want to be educated. So some of, the most highest response was in-person explanation or demonstrations, but they also have an interest like in-person driver education courses, interactive owner's manuals or in-vehicle tutorials, online driver education courses. So they perceive this need to be there as well in terms of, the need to learn on lower levels of automation, but also expanding how they learn. And on the next slide, JD Power really feels it takes a collaboration in order for this to work, that you can't just rely on the dealers. You can't rely just on the auto industry. Owner's manuals now are so full of legal jargon, it's hard to even get to exactly how these features work, right? So we need the government, we need insurance agencies to be motivating consumers and putting together programs for consumers to be educated on these technologies. So it's a collaboration that's really required to drive success, because no single source is going to be able to handle this, especially as we have more and more capability coming on from both ADAS and CV2X technologies. And we know, lastly here, that there's a lot of benefits, right? I don't have the slide in here today, but the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, put out a study about a year or two ago, and they showed just from some of these very simple level 1 technologies like blind spot warning or forward collision, that they're seeing claims going down because of this, which means accidents are also going down. There's a huge benefit, as we all know on this call, but we need to educate consumers so that they understand the benefits and how to use that technology. So thanks for letting me present. I appreciate it.
That was great, Kathy. Thanks. So a couple of high points. Trust is a checkpoint at the various stages of the ecosystem. I love that. And of course, collaboration too. I couldn't agree with you more. That driver understanding piece is so important. And I'm really seeing a trend already across our speakers today. So the statistics and the data that you shared were really meaningful. Kathy, there's a couple of questions for you in the Q&A, and if you wouldn't mind, please go ahead and head in there and answer those questions if you can, just in case we don't have time for Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Shane. Thank you so much, Kathy. Shane, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to get booted up here, so please hang in there with me for a second. Find my buttons. Here we go. Okay, we're up and running.
Looks great, Shane. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. So good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. Some really great things that I learned a lot about that have a lot of meaning for what I'm going to share with you today too. So I think it's really, really interesting. I do want to share an announcement that happened. Today is officially Kentucky Day. Our governor made that announcement for us, and it's to commemorate that Ford has been building trucks since the Model T in Kentucky for 109 years. So that's a pretty cool thing as we embark on this new technology. So, all right, let's get started with CAB at KYTC and how we are incorporating ADAS data. There are two different sets of data that we want to use to inform different things. One, to inform decision makers about public opinion, and the other is to inform capacity models for long-range planning. I'll start with the first one. This is a study that was done, a statewide AV acceptance study was done by the University of Louisville, and it was a survey. It had a couple of components to it. One was a survey, one was a simulator. The survey results were that 673 responses from 105 of Kentucky's 120 counties responded. That was a 2% rate with a margin of error of less than 5%. Results revealed, just off the top in general, summarizing it, is that 52% of Kentucky residents who responded felt positive to very positive when asked about their general attitudes towards AV technology. Also in the study, 60% participants participated in various simulated levels of driving automation in the National Advanced Driving Simulator, mini simulator, pre-programmed with level 0, defined by no automation technology, level 2 defined by engaged with adaptive advanced driver assisted systems, and level 3 and 4 defined by experiencing automated driving systems. The notable findings, what we thought was really notable, is that automated driving with human drivers behind the wheel outperformed fully human driving level 0 at all levels. And this was for avoiding traffic conflicts with decreasing the severity of rear end and ankle conflicts. And this was measured by more time to collision. So the ADAS, what was super interesting is out of the simulation, people were given the survey after the 60% participants did the simulation, they had an increased acceptance of AV technology over the survey itself. And there was another component that was in just the survey, and it was a video. So the survey was a component of before and after a video of measuring levels of acceptance. So in that where it says in the chart, figure 26, watching AV education video had a 43% acceptance rate, but after driving in a level 2, it bumped it up. So that was pretty remarkable. Education is good, but sitting in the seat is even better. And I think we heard that from JD Power, Kathleen from JD Power and Associates too. So this was in line with that. And then compared with having no automation, the physical part of this, the interesting part was people who performed better also had a higher acceptance rate. So those things went hand in hand. So it builds trust, right? That's what we basically got out of this, which I thought was pretty cool. These results we'll share with the public. We also will stand ready to help our lawmakers as they want to become informed. We have a website that we're brewing up, and so all of this sort of data will be on that website. Now, the other data that we were looking into is related to capacity. We're just beginning to dig into this data from this study, the Virginia Transportation Research Council. They looked at AVs and CAVs. It showed through simulation based on vehicle standards. There is benefit with just 2 features, adaptive cruise control and lane keeping. These things are also known as ADAS. Interesting, right? This is a vehicle that can stay in its lane and can travel closely with other vehicles. So getting back to JD Power and Associates and the other work that Marilyn is doing, yes, if people can learn how to drive these things, we can definitely see an increase in capacity. So looking closer at this study, one of the things the report points out that vehicle behavior was the most significant impact on freeway capacity is the distance or time headway at which a vehicle follows a vehicle directly ahead. That points to right now, planners, practitioners, they look at the highway capacity manual, and that manual right now assumes a theoretical maximum capacity of a freeway under ideal conditions of 2,250 to 2,400 passenger cars per hour per lane, depending on freeway speed. These equate to headways of 1.6 to 1.5 to 1.6 seconds. But the technology itself, as you can see from the screen, can be higher than that. So this is some pretty interesting data, and they looked further through analysis. They came up with guidance when you calibrate a model for CVs and AVs in simulation of freeway corridors. These are the simulations that they came up with, and notice that the LV is a legacy vehicle, so something that has no automation on it at all. The simulation-based capacity for passenger vehicles, they came up with 2,286. But if you compare that to just increasing the fleet by 20% with just the ADAS, that's adaptive cruise control and lane keeping, that increases the capacity, and it further increases the capacity with heavy vehicles. So this information, what they noted with this is that this is great in simulation, but in order to actually update capacity estimates, we need to understand actual AV and CAV market penetrations. So that's where we at the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet have started to try to understand how many ADAS vehicles with these features are in our fleet. So I asked our really smart data wonks. They explained that from vehicle registration data and NHTSA's VIN software, they are working on developing a dashboard that can give us an idea about ADAS equipped vehicles by county, one with adaptive cruise control and or lane keeping assistance. So we're pretty, and what's on the screen are examples of what that might look like. The example ADS map, that could be giving us county level data. And the box that's on the right hand of the screen, that's actually what how NHTSA describes this technology. So these are the two things that we're looking for in that data, in that VIN data. So with that, that can help us improve our capacity models for long range planning efforts. And now I'm going to give it back to you all. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. If I can't, because there's a lot of this that I can't answer, I will have to refer to our data wonk people.
That was great, Shane. Thank you. Impressive body of data and research, really helping us to determine how to build and plan for the future. And happy Kentucky Day. There's a link to an article in the chat box for all of you guys. And Shane, you do have a question in the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind hopping over there and answering that, that would be great. Okay, Steve, last but certainly not least, please take it away.
All right, I want to share my screen already. All righty. Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I have the honorable duty of batting cleanup, which means I could sit here and say what they said to every slide, or what I'm going to try to do is build in many cases on what they've said, what you've heard from the presenters before me. And I want to highlight a couple trends of things that you've heard from every one of the speakers today. First of all, first and foremost, is that, ADAS is really not a thing of the future. It really is here today. In fact, it's kind of been here for quite a while. I have a 2015 Jeep Cherokee, and I have more than half of the services you see on this list already on my vehicle. I've had it for 7 years now, which means it was probably designed more than 10 years ago. So this is not something brand new. It's something that we've had around for a while, and yet we're still struggling with the introduction. You heard Kathy talking about struggling with the actual acceptance and usage of it. So we do have a ways to go, but at least we're not starting from a position of weakness. One thing that is a little bit newer today is when they start bundling many of these ADAS features to be able to give us more advanced driving capabilities, more into the level 2 range, where, in certain operational domains, you can take your hands off or your feet off. We're still not obviously to the level yet where you can take your eyes and attention off, but at least with some of these services now, some of these features, we're starting to see the ability to go hands-free and feet-free in certain operational domains. Throughout my presentation today, I want to hit on a couple myths or things that I've heard in crowds or in different meetings and workshops over the years. And the first one I've heard a number of times, and that's that, well, ADAS is nothing more than a stepping stone along the pathway to full automation, that the auto industry can't do full self-driving, so they're going to settle for ADAS. And once they solve the self-driving problem, ADAS is going to go away. This is an extremely inaccurate and frankly a dangerous remark, because ADAS has always had an important place in the transportation ecosystem. And the reason there are multiple levels of automation is because there are multiple scenarios where it's needed. When you think about the functions that ADAS provide, they are an immediate life-saving technology, and they have some longer-term sustainable benefits. And as we've talked about today, and I'm going to continue to expand upon, ADAS is applicable across many different vehicle types and supports many different aspects of the driving task. Even when that day comes where the driving task computer begins to take over the driving task, ADAS services are still going to assist the computer, just like today it assists the human driver. So that connection between the environment, the sensors, the technology, it remains valid for the long haul, regardless of whether or not a human or a computer is operating the vehicle. So none of this is settling. I don't think anybody feels that the auto industry is settling for ADAS. This is really an important part of our future. And in fact, it's also important to remind everyone that ADAS is more than just cars. Most of the presentations you've heard today have focused on automobiles, because that's what a lot of people, when they go down to their local dealership or when they go out in the garage to go to work, they think about their own car. But when you really think about ADAS, there's many great examples outside of the regular passenger car. We have transit buses. They can, detect pedestrians or cars turning in front of them, or even potentially platoon using some of this technology. Freight vehicles can platoon, or they can have, they've benefited greatly. A lot of the studies have shown that automatic emergency braking and forward collision warning on trucks has an oversized benefit compared to passenger cars. It's even bigger. ADAS on maintenance vehicles. Those of you in states that have to plow snow, you want to have these kind of features on your snow plows and your other maintenance vehicles. Really, there's a lot of different applications, and it goes beyond just cars itself. So another myth that I've heard a lot is that ADAS is going to be incorporated by the industry, and you, the public agencies, just need to get out of the way and keep the roads in a state of good repair. That's your role in it. And I say, phooey, that's crazy. That's an old way of thinking. And it really doesn't take advantage of the safe system approach that our industry is beginning to universally grab hold of. And the safe system approach really looks at the importance of the vehicle, the roadway, the people, the technology, the education. If you put 100% of the onus on just the vehicle without incorporating the other safe system elements, you no longer have a safe system, and it's going to be a failure. You really need to look at all of these pieces of it. The conversation between the infrastructure owner operators, the IOOs, and the automotive original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, that conversation is going strong. thanks to groups like the CAT Coalition, and even your Eastern Transportation Coalition has had these conversations. That dialogue must continue. We need collaborative dialogue to be successful, and there are steps that IOOs can take today that not only help ADAS sensors, but help humans today as well. And we'd be wise to remember that 43,000 fatalities each year, it requires a system solution. There's no such thing as a one-size-all fix it for that type of that severe of a problem. So we've heard several presentations today that have really highlighted the importance of education and activities that IOOs can do that support ADAS adoption and promote this life-saving technology. Again, this isn't a new idea. It's been discussed for the better part of the decade at ITS America and other types of industry events. We've been talking about it for a while. Even USDOT started formally recommending education and engagement of the infrastructure owner operators in their 2018 AV 3.0 document that they put out. We heard earlier at the beginning of this webinar about the great work that my home state of Maryland is doing. I'm always proud to support my home state of Maryland and the work that Chrissy and her team and MDOT have been doing in terms of awareness and education. I'm proud to have contributed to some of those conversations, and even more proud that I see Maryland and many other states in the Eastern Transportation Coalition beginning to take action. You saw some of those examples that Lisa gave early on of action. It's not just words, it's not just meeting for the sake of meeting, but they're doing stuff, taking action. And it's a great lesson, I think, for everybody on this call to take home. Obviously, we're not done yet. There's plenty that we can do, and there's plenty of room to work more closely with automakers and with developers to resolve, obviously, the terminology differences, the naming conventions, and of course, to better educate and train people who are purchasing these products. But again, you can't have ultimate success if you don't have initial success. And I think that we're seeing a lot of initial success. USDOT and others have also strongly advocated that it's not just the highway agencies or the DMVs that have a role in this space, but commercial vehicle divisions. In many agencies, they're going to be impacted by this directly. Of course, we've talked many times in this webinar and in other circles about freight vehicles being early adopters for ADAS and ADS both. And that's going to have a direct impact on roadside inspections, on identification and enforcement for truck platooning. There's going to be a lot of roles for the IOOs when it comes to commercial vehicles. And of course, with transit activities and transit ADAS and ADS, many of those, most of those are public agencies that are operating them, and they're going to have a direct impactful role, whether it's the maintenance workforce or the operating workforce, who in many cases since COVID are really living this practice of having to do more with less. And now we're going to put more pressure on many of these poor transit agencies by giving them enhanced training programs and enhanced maintenance activities. So it's very important that this is not misperceived as an annoyance or a problem, but the benefits are highly touted that we talked about. And Chrissy did a really good job of explaining the benefits of why this is really important. Through some of my engagement in national committees and national projects, I've had the great benefit of talking with a lot of stakeholders on the private side. And one of the common inputs from automakers and from AV developers is that we need a state of good repair for roadways, and that they'll then design to that state. But it goes further by recognizing that despite having a rock solid MUTCD, we still often lack basic uniformity. Uniformity in the interpretation of the MUTCD, and we've even lacked some metrics for how best to enhance the readiness for many of these advanced technologies. Determining those metrics weren't taken lightly, and there's about a half dozen different studies that have been done around the world over the past 4, 5, 6 years that have really focused on better defining what vehicle sensors and cameras might look for in terms of signs and lines. It's going to come as no surprise that better contrast was universally cited in almost every research report on this topic, and even less of a surprise that, hey, better contrast also can help human drivers today. So what are we waiting for on that? As you travel around the country, you see a lot of variability in how signage and signalization is applied at intersections. We see variability in how lane markings are applied along different sites. And again, thanks to environmental differences, we also see dramatic differences in the life cycles of signs and lines, and the maintainability of sign stripes and traffic control devices, that ADAS is just expected to be able to deal with all those differences, and that's putting a lot of pressure on the sensors and the algorithms within the vehicle. So there are opportunities for the IOOs to be able to contribute to this national conversation, to contribute to solving some of these problems. And one of the big changes, and I know Roxanne's on this call, and there's probably a few others that were involved with the National Committee of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, that really looked closely into this issue and have now developed a new minimum standard for pavement marking retroreflectivity. It's the first time that a minimum number is actually there. In the past, it was just simply be visible at night. But there was never really an agreed upon minimum level. And now kudos to the NCUTCD. They've done this. This just went into effect earlier this month. And I know that there's a number of committees at the NCUTCD that is continuing to study this issue and looking further at striping, further at signs, further at traffic control devices. And many of the automakers and AV developers that I've talked to, they believe that this is great, that the IOOs have really found a lane where it can help the industry, and they're really excited and to do their part in the conversation to keep contributing to advancements. One other myth we often think about is we think, well, again, I mentioned that many of these ADAS services have been around for 7, 8, 10 years. So we think, oh, it must be a mature technology now. Well, the reality is it's really still in its infancy. There are some services and sensors that are more mature than others, but overall, we still have a lot of learning in the coming years. The good news is that everyone recognizes that these harsh environments that the systems are exposed to, it really does slow the introduction, because there's a lot of additional testing and robustness that must be done. But unfortunately, not all consumers are aware. We've become so accustomed to our consumer electronics devices that we have today that are seemingly disposable. I could buy a new iPhone every 2 years. If they'd let me buy one every 6 months, probably, if I could afford it, but I'm not going to. But we don't do that with our cars and our vehicles. We buy those vehicles and they last an average of 11.3 years. So those sensors and those systems are expected to last through all kinds of different weather and environmental conditions, without having any degradation in capability and accuracy of data. The consumer just assumes it will always work. And that's a dangerous assumption. And one of the reasons it's a dangerous assumption is that the vehicle sensors and the cameras see and interpret information differently depending on manufacturer. There's different combinations of LiDAR and radar and cameras based on the manufacturer. I think you've all heard many times, Elon Musk from Tesla saying they will not use LiDAR, whereas other companies rely heavily on it. Each manufacturer looks at calibration for sensors and cameras differently. Each manufacturer can look at algorithms that take this input, and there's 3 or 4 different approaches they can take to interpreting the data that they get from the sensors. And of course, many ADAS features, especially when you begin to bundle them into automatic lane keeping and the more advanced level 2 type services, they require active driver engagement. However, many manufacturers, or some manufacturers, have not yet incorporated a driver monitoring system to ensure that they're still paying attention, or perhaps they haven't utilized an effective driver monitoring system, which is probably the better way to put it. So just when you look at this example that I've given just here, that's 4 possible fault points. If any one of those fails, the ADAS is no longer functioning. And let me drill down one more level in this example. And again, Chrissy mentioned at the Maryland Working Group back in August, we had a really good detailed discussion on ADAS. And we talked in great detail with several different manufacturer or vendors and maintenance folks about the importance of calibration. The calibration of sensors and cameras. First of all, it can differ by manufacturer. which is quite scary to begin with. If your vehicle is in a minor fender bender, or even if you just need a new windshield, you have to realize there are sensors involved. There are sensors in your front bumper. There are sensors in your rear view mirror or connected to your windshield. And anytime something happens, whether it's a slight bump or the change in the windshield, those sensors must be recalibrated. There's no guarantee they're going to work unless they've been recalibrated. And of course, there are different types of calibration. There's the static, where there's a bucket, a shop that has a fixture on it. And those differ by manufacturer. There's the dynamic driving calibration that some ADAS services require, but not all. And again, it differs by manufacturer. So if you've taken the vehicle back to your original dealer, your original equipment manufacturer dealer, your car dealer, they should have the right equipment and they should have the right training, but even that isn't a given. And if you've taken the vehicle to your local mom and pop mechanic, chances are even higher that they may not have the correct calibration and the right equipment. So again, one potential component of failure in this, one sensor, there could be as many as 10 sensors between the front bumper and the windshield. If just one of those is not calibrated correctly, again, you may get a false positive and your ADAS may not be functional. So we have a lot of failure points in this system on a vehicle that can get a lot of rugged use out in a lot of rugged environment, and we still have a ways to go, but we're making progress on it. So what's next? What's next? Where do we go from here with all this? Well, I think I was asked to kind of talk about where we're going to go in the future, and I want to really talk about it in terms of 3 different buckets. And the first one, those of you that know me know that I can't go to any presentation without talking about connectivity, because as I live and die, it's always going to be the importance of connectivity to the future of automation. And anyone who was at the ITS World Congress last week probably got a sense that V2X really has not gone away. It might have taken a brief pause in the United States, but globally, there's a lot of conversation about it too. And thanks to recent actions by the US DOT, I really do sense a resurgence, a re-energizing here in the United States with V2X. The USD has pledged to help develop a national deployment vision and a roadmap, and that's really kind of led to a reemergence of the conversation. There are states, and especially within your coalition, Georgia and Florida in particular, that never did pause, and they continued to boldly go where others were not going. But now I think we're going to see other agencies step up, and we're going to see a renewed emphasis on this. And that means for you agencies, a renewed emphasis on roadside communications and preparing your agency fleet vehicles for V2X installations. The second point, and Chrissy, and I think every speaker has mentioned the word collaboration, and Lisa pointed that out. And that's really important that we continue that collaboration and that dialogue between the IOOs and the ADAS and ADS stakeholders, whether it's auto OEMs or vendors or product developers or AV developers. It's absolutely critical that we keep this conversation going, keep that conversation energized, and continually looking for opportunities to advance the conversation. As you agencies within the coalition, you need to continue incorporating CAV into your future policy and your long-range transportation plans and your workforce discussions. I know many of you have statewide or agency-wide work groups, and really that is hands down the best method for continuing a lot of the conversation within your agency, within your state, within your borders. I participate in a number of statewide working groups, not just Maryland's, and I got to say that method is so simple, but it's so tried and true. It keeps the conversation, it keeps the dialogue going. And finally, remain engaged in the regulatory evolution. And I realize that's kind of a vague term, but if I've learned anything from working around the country and visiting other countries around the world, it's that trying to get it right on the first try is darn near impossible when it comes to legislative and regulatory language. Even Florida, who was one of the first to get legislative language out, has already redone it 2 or 3 times. And we're going to see other states, that need to take that step forward. If you try to get the language perfect, you're going to keep trying. Perfect is the enemy of good in this place. Get some legislative language started, get some support from your decision makers, and be ready to adapt. And beyond your own borders, keep giving support towards the, we need a national framework of regulatory consistency across the United States and across jurisdictional boundaries. So keep that conversation going as well, so that we can integrate more effectively and integrate more efficiency. So that's my presentation, Lisa. I welcome an ongoing conversation about this and in the future.
That was great, Steve. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our presenters. Okay, Steve, you set me up perfectly for the one question that we have time for here. Let's start with Chrissy, and we'll go to Kathleen and then Shane. Here's a question for all of our panelists. How does all of this body of knowledge really coalesce into a national strategy? We all kind of touched on that a little bit. So many initiatives underway. What's most meaningful for our industry to move forward? Is it deployments, guidance, test facilities, all of the above? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we could probably have an hour discussion on just that question alone, but I think each state has kind of focused in different areas. I mean, some states are really heavily focused in terms of deployment. Other states are really focused in terms of the education component of it. What I think is important is exactly what Steve ended. It's the conversation, bringing folks to the table, ensuring that everybody is engaged, government, non-government, academia, private sector, having everybody as part of the conversation, so that as the technology continues to evolve, we're all learning together, we're all sharing information together. Absent the federal government acting, a lot of this activity is happening at the state level. And so it's really incumbent upon us not only be working within our jurisdictions, but sharing information through avenues like this, through other national associations. So we're all working together and not reinventing the wheel, because I know we hear from our private sector partners that the more consistency they have, the easier it makes it for the technology to continue to move forward. And I know that's all of our goal. We don't want to stand in the way of it, but we want to make sure it's also safe on our roadways.
Absolutely. Kathy, and then I think Shane, you're going to have our last word for today.
No, I totally agree with what Chrissy was saying. I mean, it's a collaboration, right? We need to keep the conversation going, and we have to all work towards standardization across many of these metrics, not just consumer education.
Very important, Shane.
Okay, those experts in front of me said a lot. I'm not sure that I would have a lot to add to that from a state DOT perspective. We are closely paying attention to how we fund these things. How do we maintain these roadways and this potential hardware that we're going to put on them? So staying engaged that way, and not only be aware of how the technology works, but be aware of what that's going to mean for all of us as taxpayers to get the best benefit out of this.
Yes, absolutely. That funding piece is critical as well. So, well, thank you all for joining us today, and a very big thank you to all of our presenters. We will be providing the slides to you via email, and we will be posting this recording on our website and on our Coalition YouTube page. Joanna, is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, thank you again to everyone participating, and of course to our wonderful speakers.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.